Good afternoon, everyone. Before I introduce our speaker for today, I just want to ask for an apology because our webinar for today is on Expanded Trafficking in Person Act 2012. Nasa isip ko kasi 2021 eh. Parang ano ang aga. So, this person is very close to my heart. He's a very nice person and we've known for almost 1 year and then hindi siya nagdalawang salita o nagdalawang isip na para mag-join sa Rotary. He was inducted last August. Okay, so I'd like to say that this person, Attorney Ismael Sarangaya Jr., is a member of the Philippine Bar since 2013 and obtained his Bachelor of Laws degrees, now Juris Doctor, from the University of Santo Tomas Faculty of Civil Law, first honorable mention in 2012. Aside from being a Dean's Lister, he won numerous debate competitions as president of the UST Law debate team. He was a former legal intern at the International Justice Mission, a non-government organization which specializes in prosecuting human trafficking and child abuse cases. In 2008, he received his Bachelor of Arts in Legal Management degree from Bulacan State University, magna cum laude, best in specialization, outstanding student awardee, and academic excellence awardee, and leadership awardee. He was also a regional finalist in the 10 outstanding students of the Philippines for Region 3. He was a former senior associate in top law firm in Makati City where he practiced litigation, construction arbitration, labor and employment, and intellectual property. He represented clients from various industries such as education, real estate, convenience stores, banks, investment, construction, knowledge process outsourcing, health maintenance organization, hospital online shopping, coffee business, agro-industrial manpower, mining, and leasing of advertising spaces. He was also one of the firm's resource persons in labor-related issues. In 2020, he established his own law firm, the Sarangaya Law Offices. His areas of practice include litigation, labor and employment, alternative dispute resolution, corporate compliance, intellectual property, estate settlement, property law, construction, dispute, and data privacy. Also, attorney Ismael Sarangaya Jr. was recently appointed as Associate Dean of Philippine Christian University College of Law. He is currently a faculty member at University of Santo Tomas Faculty of Civil Law and Philippine Christian University College of Law, where he teaches Constitutional Law 1 and 2 and Public Corporations. He is also a bar lecturer of Magnificus Juris Reviews and Seminars Incorporated and Villas Law Center. He also rendered a lecture on oral advocacy for the 2019 mandatory continuing legal education program conducted by the Center for Global Best Practices and Lyceum of the Philippines University. He was a former faculty member at Bulacan State University College of Law and College of Criminal Justice Education. Without further ado, I'd like and proud to introduce to you our very own attorney Ismael Sarangaya Jr.
Maraming salamat po, LCP Madel. Good afternoon. Soon to be good evening na. No? It's 5:42. No? So, a blessed afternoon to each and everyone, fellow Rotarians and guests. It is my distinct honor to be invited, no, as a speaker and of our club. No? This is my mother club. So our topic for this afternoon is very timely because Rotary is celebrating uh, or advocating women's rights through various activities. In fact, to be candid with you, LCP Madel and I were thinking of conducting a webinar about the anti-violence against women and children. But the topic is very popular that the other clubs have already conducted webinars on the same topic. But the topic for this afternoon is timely also, and we will be discussing a very important piece of legislation that protects not only women, by the way, no, but also children and actually all persons. No? It's just that this legislation, although it protects all persons, but in reality, most of those who were victims are really women or children or those who cannot protect themselves from abuses. So with the permission of the hosts, let me share my screen so I can show my presentation. So we'll be discussing this afternoon Republic Act number 10364 or the expanded Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act of 2012. So tama si LCP, hindi po 2021, no? So this has been in effect since 2012. Now let's try to understand our situation. This is based on the trafficking profile as found in the website of the US Department of State. So as you know, tayo pong mga Pilipino, ang ating bansa, marami tayong mga pinapadala na mga overseas Filipino workers abroad. So given that reality, there are several Filipinos, mga kababayan natin, ang susceptible to human trafficking because most of the victims were lured with job opportunities overseas. And in fact, there are several industries involved like fishing, no, shipping, construction, manufacturing, education, home, healthcare, and agriculture, among other things, no, among other jobs, no, na ino-offer sa ating mga kababayan. Mo, kikita ka dito, no? So why don't you try this opportunity overseas? And then and there, after the Filipino, mostly women, no, would agree to that proposition, they would find themselves in a very abusive environment. Take note also that the Philippines, according to the US Department of State, is one of the main sources of online exploitation of children. Especially now that most of the transactions are done online. No? And we have video conference meetings. No? Due to the pandemic, people could not go out to find employment. So people would tend to resort to illegal activities such as online sex trafficking. And even before the pandemic, of course, we brag about our tourism, right? We have beautiful beaches, we have resorts, we have tourist destinations. But sometimes those tourist destinations are being utilized uh, by perpetrators to traffic both women and children. And also, I hate to say this, but this is part of the trafficking profile prepared by the US State Department. But also in areas where there is conflict, particularly those involving Abu Sayyaf, no? Or the Moro National Liberation Front, or even the Maute group, no? They employ children. For what purpose? To be used in their warfare against the government. So it's not just sex trafficking. It's not just online sexual exploitation of children, which uh, is a problem here in the Philippines. But also, take note, even the use of children for purposes of armed conflict. So that is a major concern here in our country. Now, the good news is the Philippines fully meets the minimum standards for the elimination of trafficking. In fact, the very enactment of the expanded Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act of 2012, no? The very enactment of the said law is an indication that the government is serious about its efforts to curb human trafficking. No? But there are certain challenges also. So for instance, those government officials who are involved in committing trafficking in persons are not investigated, as well as fraudulent recruiters and labor traffickers. They are not being prosecuted consistently. Not to mention that the community reintegration services, including trauma-informed care, employment training, and job placement for survivors also remain inadequate. So these provisions must be improved according to the report of the US State Department. Now in the Philippines, we have two laws that deal with the subject. The Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act of 2003. There are certain provisions or items which are still in effect, no, yung RA 9208. But the said law was expanded by RA 10364. No? Okay. Now let's define trafficking in persons. So trafficking in persons refers to the recruitment, obtaining, hiring, providing, take note of this, offering. So the very act of offering by itself, coupled with the other elements, would constitute trafficking in persons. Transportation, transfer, maintaining, harboring, or receipt of persons with or without the victim's consent or knowledge, within or across national borders by means of threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power, or of position, taking advantage of the vulnerability of the person, or the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person, having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation, which includes at a minimum the exploitation or the prostitution of others or other forms of sexual exploitation, forced labor or services, slavery, servitude, or the removal or sale of organs. Attorney, masyado mahaba yung definition. Baka di naman namin matandaan yan. So let's try to dissect the definition. So for brevity, let us refer to the items recruitment, obtaining, hiring, providing, offering, transportation, transfer, maintaining, harboring or receipt of persons with or without the victim's consent or knowledge within or across national borders. Let's refer to these as acts. Okay? So these are the acts that would constitute trafficking in persons. But these acts would not suffice to constitute trafficking in persons without the other two factors, the other two elements. No? So we have to also consider the means employed in the commission of these acts and for what purpose. Why? For example, no, recruitment, no, for a compensation. Kung wala yung purpose, baka at best it would just be illegal recruitment, not trafficking in persons, right? So mahalaga na i-consider din natin yung means and purpose in the commission of human trafficking or trafficking in persons. So we have to take into account how these acts were committed, through what means. No? So dapat may threat, may use of force, no, or other forms of coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power or of position, taking advantage of vulnerability of the person, or the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person. Ang pinakamahalaga, yung purpose. No? The purpose must be for exploitation. So, ilan sa mga na-enumerate? Sexual exploitation, no? Prostitution, no? Forced labor or services, slavery. Anong pinagkaiba ng forced labor or services sa slavery? Doon sa slavery, it's as if the person is being treated as a possession. The one who is enslaving another treats that person as a possession. So it's as if pagmamay-ari nitong taong ito yung kanyang slave, no? Sa forced labor or services, the person having control over another gives an impression that if the victim does not comply with the directive of the abuser or the perpetrator, no, then something bad would happen to that person. Okay? Take note also, yung mga nakikita ninyo sa social media, yung puting van, no, na sinasabi nila nangunguha ng bata. So also removal or sale of organs is also part of the enumeration. Nonetheless, as far as a child is concerned, as long as the purpose is for exploitation, or when the adoption is induced by any form of consideration for exploitative purposes, even if the means set forth in the enumeration, ito po yung means, kahit wala po yung mga means na yan, it would still be considered as trafficking in persons. Okay? For obvious reasons. because a child cannot give a valid consent. Question: are those considered a child under the law those under 18 years of age? The answer is yes and no. Those persons who are 18 below 18 years of age, they're considered a child unless a person cannot protect himself or herself from abuses, then that person can still be considered as a child, even if that person is already 18 years of age and above. So if, for example, the mental, physical, or emotional condition of that person such that he or she cannot protect himself or herself from abuse, then that person, even if over the age of 18, can still be considered as a child. Later on, I will show you why the definition of a child is very important. Now, these are the specific acts of trafficking in persons. No? So the acts here as enumerated, take note, the acts were done under the pretext of domestic or overseas employment or training or apprenticeship, but the purpose is for prostitution, pornography, or sexual exploitation. Inalok, galing probinsya, magtrabaho ka bilang kasambahay. Pero nung nakarating sa Maynila, ginawang sex slave o ibinenta for prostitution. Mag-post ka dyan. Bibidyohan ka. No? So that is considered as a specific act of trafficking in person. To maganda. Itong second instance or act of trafficking in persons. Halimbawa, galing sa probinsya ulit. Ipapakilala kita doon sa pinsan ko, no? Na may kakilalang German national, no? So naghahanap kasi ng mapapangasawa. When in fact, the purpose of that is for prostitution, pornography, sexual exploitation, forced labor, slavery, involuntary servitude, or debt bondage. Inalila lang ng hindi pinapasweldo o hindi kaya ginawang prostitute, ibinenta ang serbisyo, o hindi kaya pinag-post ng nakahubot-hubad, hindi kaya ginawang alipin. So that is also a specific act of trafficking in persons. Okay? Yung tao mismo nag-alok ng kasal. I wanna marry you. No? But whether the marriage is valid or invalid, that's irrelevant. As long as there is an offer of marriage, or even if there is an actual marriage, as long as the purpose again, is for prostitution, pornography, sexual exploitation, forced labor or slavery, involuntary servitude, or debt bondage. That is still trafficking in persons. Meron po ba tayo dito owner ng travel agency? If, for example, a travel agency organizes a tour, but in the process, one of the stopovers would be, let's say, a club where persons are offered for prostitution, or for pornography or sexual exploitation. Ito po'y kwento-kwento lang. Ako hindi pa napupunta, hopefully soon, no, when the pandemic is over. I hope to be able to go to Thailand. According to friends were telling me stories, talagang kailangan ano daw, destination daw talaga yung kanilang red light district wherein talagang panonoorin yung mga babae doon for a show. So here in the Philippines, that cannot be done. Those travel agencies who are organizing tours, they cannot use as a stopover, for example, in Boracay or in Puerto Galera or in other tourist destinations. They cannot use as a stopover a place wherein persons are either utilized or offered for prostitution, pornography, or sexual exploitation. To maintain or hire a person to engage in prostitution or pornography. So, nandun sa bahay, pinag-i-stay lang sa bahay para pagka may customer, iaalok. Or di kaya bibidyohan. Hindi rin po yun po pwede. No? Or to adopt persons by any form of consideration for exploitative purposes or to facilitate the same for purposes of prostitution, pornography, sexual exploitation, forced labor, slavery, involuntary servitude, or debt bondage. That's why our courts are very meticulous about the reasons for the adoption. Because ultimately, the purpose of adoption, whether domestic or inter-country, is for the best interest of the child. Ngayon, kapag kaya adopt yung tao, yung bata or kahit naman adult, no, under certain circumstances pwedeng i-adopt. Pagka ang tao ay i-adopt but these are the hidden purposes, no, for the adoption, then that is also an act of trafficking in persons. And mind you, once it is established that the adoption is for this purpose, the decree of adoption is automatically rescinded. Also, to adopt or facilitate the adoption of persons for the purpose of prostitution, pornography, sexual exploitation, forced labor, slavery, involuntary servitude, or debt bondage. So hindi lang po yung mismong nag-ampon, even yung nag-facilitate. So which makes me wonder, are the lawyers liable if the adoption was ultimately for the purpose of prostitution, etc.? My submission is if they have full knowledge, no? If they have full knowledge of these purposes, then they may be held liable. By the way, I saw if initially a victim or his or her family was not able to file a complaint or case of trafficking due to circumstances, is there a prescriptive? Yes. We will discuss this, Sir LCP Romel. Meron tayong provision on prescriptive period. Dalawa ang prescriptive periods natin. So, i-discuss po natin yan in a bit. At kung sino ang pwedeng mag-file, i-discuss din po natin. Also, no, if the acts, no, are done for the purpose of removal or sale of organs of the victim, kailangan kasi ng ng tatay ko ng atay, for example, no, or kailangan ng kapitbahay namin ng bato. Ano ba yung mga organ transplant, or bato or kidney or a portion of the liver, what have you, no? I don't know. There are people we have guests from a hospital. No? So pagka niloko, pinwersa, inintimidate for the purpose of removal or sale of organs, no? Then that is also trafficking in persons. Now, to recruit, to perform the acts, no, for brevity, no, to perform the acts or included here to adopt a child in armed activities. So for example, let's not mention a specific group, ABC rebel group, which tries to liberate a portion of the Philippines. No? The commander engages a child, no, para maging parte ng armed forces nila. So that is also trafficking in persons. And to be candid with you, I believe this is an ongoing violation because there are minors who are being enlisted to take up arms, no, for either against the government or in pursuit of their ideology. Also, the commission of the acts, no, for forced labor, slavery, debt bondage, and involuntary servitude. Take note, no, of these beliefs, no, being planted or imbued in the mind of the victim. The victim has this belief or impression that if he does not perform the labor or service, then something bad would happen to him or her. Either serious physical harm, no? Or it could be in the form of a legal process. Makukulong ka, no? Pagka hindi mo ginawa to, hindi ka nagpaalipin sa akin dito sa bahay, gawin mo lahat ng gawaing bahay dito. Kung hindi, ipakukulong kita. Tandaan mo, ang mahal ng nagastos ko sa iyo para makarating ka sa Maynila. No? So again, that's a specific act of trafficking in persons. Of course, the performance of the acts, no, for purposes of exploitation or trading them, no? So, for instance, the act of bearing and/or selling a child, no, for any consideration or for barter for purposes of exploitation. So for example, umupa ng babae para magbuntis. Para magbuntis. O di kaya pagkatapos manganak yung bata, ibebenta. Ipapaampon for a consideration. So that is also, no, a form of trafficking in persons. Take note also of the specific exploitative purposes in your screen. Lalo-lalo na yung mga gumagamit ng bata for drug trafficking. No? So, we of course support all efforts against drugs, lalo-lalo na kapag gumagamit ng bata. Ang ayaw lang natin, no, ay biktima na nga yung bata, yung mga pulis, papatayin pa nila yung bata. So that's another issue. Hindi ka nga participant directly, hindi ikaw yung diretso nag-aalok, nagbebenta, nag-hire, nagme-maintain, etc. But you're the ones issuing the directive. You're the one organizing. Then you're still liable as if you are the direct perpetrator. So take note, what's the term of imprisonment? 20 years and a fine of not less than 1 million pesos but not more than 2 million pesos. That would seriously hurt. Now, we have new provisions also because, again, the legislators expanded the scope of trafficking in persons to include even the attempted stage, no, as well as the accomplices and accessories. So 10364, no, defines attempted trafficking in persons to mean the commission of acts to initiate the commission of a trafficking offense, but the offender failed to or did not execute all the elements of the crime by accident or by reason of some other cause, no, other than voluntary desistance. No? So the person already started but did not finish. So even in other crimes defined under the revised penal code, mostly, except for those crimes that do not admit of an attempted stage, then yan po, attempted stage ay pinaparusahan ng batas. And here under RA 10364, our legislators became specific that the penalties, no, meaning the criminal liability should not just be imposed to those who committed the crime in its consummated stage. Now, even if in its attempted stage, then the perpetrator can still be held liable. And there's a specific penalty. So just take note of the acts which are considered as attempted trafficking in persons. No? So if the offender facilitates the travel of a child who travels alone to a foreign country or territory without valid reason, no? So that is already trafficking in its attempted stage. So dapat may clearance from the DSWD or a written permit or justification from the child's parent or legal guardian. Number 2, no? Executing for a consideration an affidavit of consent or a written consent for adoption. So up to a certain age, a written consent is required for adoption. What if the parent, no, the parent executes, no, written consent, binayaran siya? That is already trafficking, no, in the attempted stage. No? So the fact na nagpabayad ka, so delikado po yun, no, sa mga gustong-gustong mag-ampon. So kung ayaw nyo makulong yung magpapaampon, so dapat po wag po tayo mag-offer ng anumang consideration, wag yung bayaran para lang po magkaanak ako, please. No? Baka pwedeng bigyan ko po kayo ng 3 milyon. Gustong-gusto ko lang magka-baby. Mapapahamak po yung nag-execute ng affidavit or written consent. Recruiting a woman to bear a child for the purpose of selling the child. So this item, no, penalizes the recruitment of a woman, but take note of the purpose, the bearing of a child for the purpose of selling the child. So if the purpose is not for selling the child, it may not fall under attempted trafficking in persons, no? So pagka binayaran yung babae to bear a child, no, for any consideration for purposes of exploitation, acts na po yon of trafficking in persons, no? As you can see here in item 11. So mas mataas po kasi ang penalty ng acts of trafficking kesa dun sa attempted stage. 15 years po ang penalty, no? Imprisonment and a fine of not less than 500,000 pesos but not more than 1 million pesos. Accomplice, one who aids or abets the perpetrator by prior or simultaneous act. Makikita nyo rin po yan sa revised penal code. In-include ng ating mga legislators sa 10364. So, same penalty. Accessories, no? Defined also under the revised penal code. In-include din dito, no, as a new provision in RA 10364. So, those who have knowledge of the commission of the crime and without having participated in the crime either as a principal or as an accomplice, take part in the commission in any of these manners by profiting themselves or assisting the offender to profit by the effects of the crime. No? By concealing or destroying the body of the crime or effects or instruments thereof in order to prevent its discovery. No? Or by harboring, concealing, or assisting in the escape of the principal of the crime. No? Provided the accessory acts with abuse of his or her public functions or is known to be habitually guilty of some other crime. So yung mga nagpapatakas noong primarily guilty of trafficking in persons, so they can be held liable as accessories o nagtatago ng mga ginamit o nung mismong krimen, they can be held liable as accessories. So same penalty. There are also acts which are considered promotion of trafficking in persons. Nagpaupa ka ng bahay mo, building, or establishment for the purpose of promoting trafficking in persons. No? So may mga nagiging liable dito. Or to reproduce, print, issue, or distribute unissued, tampered, or fake counseling certificates, registration stickers, dinagdag dito sa RA 10364 na wala sa 9208, overseas employment certificates, or other certificates of any government agency which issues these certificates, decals, and such other markers as proof of compliance with government regulatory and pre-departure requirements for the purpose of promoting trafficking in persons. No? So namimeke ng mga dokumento. No? So for instance, pineke yung clearance from the DSWD. So that is a pre-departure requirement, especially for minors, right? Otherwise, magiging attempted trafficking siya kung walang clearance, as we've discussed earlier. Now, kung pineke naman, may nameke, yung taong nameke ng clearance mananagot for the crime of acts that promote trafficking in persons. So again, let's correlate here. So kailangan ng clearance muna from the DSWD before a child may be able to travel alone. But who will allow a person, a child, to travel alone? No? So, kung may nameke, ang magiging krimen ay acts that promote trafficking in persons. Those who advertise, publish, print, broadcast, distribute, or cause the advertisement, publication, printing, broadcasting, or distribution by any means, including information technology and the internet, of any brochure, flyer, or any propaganda material that promotes trafficking in persons. So please be very careful about the dating website, because it could have an ulterior motive of trafficking persons. Meron po tayong kasabay na may discussion. Another item here would be assisting in the conduct of misrepresentation or fraud for purposes of facilitating the acquisition of clearances and necessary exit documents. So usually yung mga travel agencies nag-a-assist din dito. So please take note that if the assistance rendered by such entities for the purpose of conducting misrepresentation or fraud in facilitating the requirements for pre-departure registration, no? And ultimately to facilitate the departure of victims, then that is an act of promotion, no? Of trafficking in persons. So when the traffic person is recruited to engage in prostitution with any member of the military or law enforcement agencies, ibinugaw, no, sa militar o di kaya sa mga law enforcers. When the offender is a member of the military or law enforcement agencies, that by itself is a crime, no? Or kapag ka nahawa yung biktima, no, ng HIV or AIDS, or if by reason of the trafficking the victim dies, becomes insane, or suffers mutilation. So dahil nag-recruit ng mga kasambahay, forced labor, hindi pala conducive yung environment na hawa ng COVID. No? So that is considered acts that promote trafficking in persons. Those who tamper with, destroy, or cause the destruction of evidence, or to influence or attempt to influence witnesses. Kadalasan po na mga nagko-commit nito, kung hindi po mga bugaw o mga rebelde, mga malalaking kumpanya na nag-ooperate ng mga nightclubs. May mga pera. So they have the tendency to resort to this, no? So that is an act of promotion of trafficking in persons. No? Also, those who destroy, conceal, remove, confiscate, or possess, or any attempt to do this, no? Any actual or purported passport or any travel, immigration, or working permit or document, or any other actual or purported government identification of any person in order to prevent or restrict or attempt to prevent or restrict without lawful authority the movement of the victim in order to maintain his or her labor or services. So yung mga nagtatago po ng passport, alam po natin sa ibang bansa may mga gumagawa na employers niyan, na mga nag-hire ng kasambahay. Dito sa Pilipinas, here in the Philippines, if that is done by the employer, no, tago mo yung passport, sunugin yung passport so that the person would not be able to leave, then that constitutes promotion of trafficking in person. Or those, this would apply, no, to those who are in government office, no, who would impede the investigation, prosecution, or execution of lawful orders in a case under this law. So again, same penalty, acts that promote, no, trafficking in persons. Now, what are those acts which are considered qualified trafficking in persons? Ito po, dapat niyong malaman kasi malaki po ang, mas mataas po ang penalty ng qualified. When we say qualified, means those circumstances which, if present, would warrant the imposition of a higher penalty. No? So, for instance, when the traffic person is a child, diba, dinefine natin ng child, hindi lang siya yung persons below 18 years of age. That person could be 18 and above as long as that person cannot adequately protect himself or herself in view of his circumstances, then that person can be considered as a child. And if a child is trafficked or is a victim of trafficking, then the perpetrator is guilty of qualified trafficking in persons. Also, no, if the purposes are pursued by means of adoption through the Inter-Country Adoption Act. No? Take note. So, kaya rin dumadaan sa proseso para mag-grant yung inter-country adoptions because of this, no? We want to make sure, aside from the fact that we want to protect the best interest of the child, the courts are also concerned that this would not be used as a vehicle, no, for exploitation. Also, when the crime is committed by a syndicate or in large scale. So this matters doon po kay LCP LCP Romel, no? This matters, no? Because of the prescriptive period, no? So when we say syndicated, it means it is committed or carried out by a group of 3 or more persons, no? Conspiring or confederating with one another. No? It is also being committed in large scale naman kung ang mga biktima nito ay 3 or more persons, whether individually or as a group. Now, when the offender is a spouse, no? An ascendant, parent, sibling, guardian, or a person who exercises authority over the trafficked person, no? Or when the offense is committed by a public officer or employee. So may katungkulan sa gobyerno, then that is qualified trafficking in person. When the trafficked person is recruited to engage in prostitution with any member of the military or law enforcement agencies. No? So when the offender is a member of the military or law enforcement agencies, that's also qualified trafficking in person. So when by reason or on occasion of the act of trafficking, namatay, naging insane, suffered mutilation, or nahawa ng HIV or AIDS. No? We also have to deal with frequency, no? Under item H, when the offender commits 1 or more violations over a period of 60 days. Yung section 4 po, yun po yung specific acts of trafficking. No? Whether continuous or not. No? So when the offender directs or through another manages the trafficking victim in carrying out the exploitative purpose, no, of trafficking. So if these circumstances are present, malala po ang penalty. Life imprisonment. Iba po yan sa reclusion perpetua. Yan po ay walang period. Ang reclusion perpetua, no, has a period, no? At i-impose din po ang hukuman ng penalty of not less than 2 million pesos but not more than 5 million pesos. Now, the law, no, protects the privacy of trafficked persons. No? So, details pertaining to the investigation, prosecution, and trial of a trafficked person, no, are confidential. And if you will look at Supreme Court decisions, even the names of the accused sometimes are anonymized. Because if the persons are identified, then that would facilitate the identification of the victim. That's why ina-anonymize in certain cases, lalo na kapag related yung biktima doon sa offender. So may penalty po if, let's say, the media outfits publicize the details, no, the name, personal circumstances, no, or any person that would establish the identity of a trafficked person. The only exception to this, no, is when the traffic person voluntarily gives his or her consent in writing, no, and duly notarized. Otherwise, there would be a penalty of 6 years imprisonment and fine of not less than 500,000 pesos, but not more than 1 million pesos. So the law enforcement agencies are tasked to investigate, no, and conduct counter-trafficking intelligence gathering upon receipt of statements or affidavits from victims. No? So inaatasan po, in fact, meron pong specific division, no, sa Department of Justice ang iakat, no? So they are specifically mandated to ensure that human trafficking or trafficking in persons in the Philippines is abated. Now, usually under the revised penal code and under our criminal procedure, ang pwedeng mag-initiate ng kaso, usually the offended party or the law enforcement officers. But under this particular law, 10364, even those who have personal knowledge of the commission of any offense may initiate, no, a case against a perpetrator. Pwede bang maareglo? Paano pag naareglo yung biktima, binayaran ng malaki? Or, no? It doesn't matter because the execution of an affidavit of desistance, no, would not warrant the dismissal of a case for trafficking in persons. In fact, prosecutors are directed to oppose any motion for the withdrawal of the information or the dismissal of the case on the ground of desistance of the private offended party. So doon naman po sa mga gagamit ng serbisyo ng persons who are victims, no? So meron din pong karampatang parusa, no? Use of traffic persons po yan. And there are specific penalties imposed, no, upon those who will have sexual intercourse or lascivious or who would commit lascivious conduct with a child. Those who are involved in carnal knowledge or sexual intercourse with a male or trafficking victim, no, to the use of force, meaning kung gagahasain, no, because simply put, may use of force or intimidation, deprived of reason under 12 years of age, that is simply rape, no? So there's a specific penalty imposed here also. So those who would use traffic persons, no, with knowledge that the person is a victim, there's a specific penalty also. And if the offender knows any of the qualifying circumstances for trafficking, there's also a specific penalty. For foreigners, aside from the penalties, no, they will also be immediately deported. And if an offender is a public official, aside from the penalties provided under the law, they would also suffer perpetual absolute disqualification to hold public office, no, and in addition to imprisonment or fine as provided under the law. Now, ito po yung tanong ni LCP. 10 years po ang prescriptive period. No? No? So, if the act is committed by a syndicate or in a large scale, mas malaki. So that's the relevance. That's the point that I was raising a while ago. That's why it matters if the act is done by a syndicate or in a large scale. So usually, the prescriptive period would run for either from the time of commission or the time of discovery. But here, the prescriptive, the reckoning point for the start of the running of the prescriptive period would be favorable to the offended party and unfavorable to the offender. Why? Because it would run from the day on which the trafficked person is delivered or released from the conditions of bondage. Or in case of a child, from the day the child reaches the age of majority. So, pareho lang naman yung rule sa interruption. Pero mahalaga, kailan tatakbo yung prescriptive period? So, hindi porke na-discover, no? Or kung kailan na-commit, no? Nagbibigay ng allowance kung kailan makawala, or kung child yan, kung kailan siya mag-reach ng age of majority. What happens to the victims? Suppose there are really activities, no, sexual activities. Would it prejudice the victim? The victim would not be penalized, and it doesn't matter if the person consented or not. It's irrelevant. And mind you, under Article 202 of the Revised Penal Code, prostitution is also penalized. But the person will be considered a victim of trafficking in persons cannot be prosecuted under Article 202 of the Revised Penal Code. So, ang posible na lang sigurong managot dito, no, ay yung mga nasa hustong gulang na walang taong gumagamit sa kanila, sila voluntaryong nag-aalok ng serbisyo. Now, for temporary custody, no, of victims, so this will be done with the assistance of the DSWD or an accredited NGO. So during my time with the IJM, International Justice Mission, when I was still a legal intern way back 2011, no? So that international NGO is concerned with rendering assistance also aside from its prosecutorial services, because it extended its partnership also with the Department of Justice as far as prosecution is concerned, but it also renders assistance in the rescue of victims. In fact, IJM also has social workers. So I'm happy and I'm proud to be part of that international non-government organization. So the victim would be placed in a temporary custody, no, of the local social welfare and development office or any accredited or licensed shelter institution devoted to protecting trafficked persons after the rescue. Paano po kung di na virgin o in colloquial terms, dating may experience, mahilig na yung tao, it doesn't matter. No? The sexual predisposition, the reputation, or the consent, no, of the victim is irrelevant as long as the means, no, that we discussed, force, coercion, intimidation, fraud, no, etc. As long as those means are present, it doesn't matter if the victim is a virgin or who had previous sexual inclinations, no, or who had a reputation for past sexual behaviors. It wouldn't matter. It's not a defense. Now, some updates from the Supreme Court. So, especially in the crime of prostitution, it doesn't matter if the trafficker's clients are absent, no? Or whether there is actual intercourse, it doesn't matter. No? That's not an element as long as the person is hired, no, maintained, offered, no, as long as those acts are present, performed through the means that we've enumerated for the purpose of prostitution, then that would already be considered an act of trafficking in persons. So take note also that leasing a room for the purpose of prostitution is an act to promote trafficking, not qualified trafficking. No? Take note that what is being qualified here are acts of trafficking under Section 4, no, of RA 10364, no, or 9208 as amended by R 10364, not the acts to promote trafficking. No? So meaning yung mga acts, mga specific acts of trafficking in persons, when the qualifying circumstances are present, then yun yung mga pwedeng magwaran ng imposition ng life imprisonment. Not those which are considered acts to promote trafficking. No? So just like what I've discussed earlier, consent, no, is irrelevant, especially if the victim is a minor. No? Hindi siya makakapagbigay ng meaningful consent. So, in the case of Arambulo versus People, that was emphasized. 2 years ago lang itong Supreme Court decision na ito. Also, in People versus Ramirez, no? Here, the accused hired children to engage in prostitution. So, through the testimonies of the minors, no, the guilt of the accused was established. So, the fact that the minors gave their consent is irrelevant. That is not a valid defense. And here, the Supreme Court also emphasized that in acts of trafficking, moral damages and exemplary damages may also be awarded in favor of the victims. So, most of the time, there are no documents here. No? There are no tangible pieces of evidence, only testimonial evidence. So in People versus May Cabalong, the Supreme Court relied on the strength of the testimonies of the witnesses, primarily the victim and that of, or those of the police officers. So the Supreme Court here concluded that the offender is guilty on the strength of testimonial evidence. And here, nakakapanlumo in People versus XXX and YYY, this is a case, this is an example wherein the identity of the accused is anonymized because they are related. No? They are related to the victims who are all minors. They were offered for prostitution and pornography so that the family would earn. So that was the explanation. So that is not acceptable, of course. So here, the accused, no, who are biological parents of the victims, were held liable or guilty of qualified trafficking in persons. And also, the other accused here was also held liable for one count of qualified trafficking in persons because that person transported and provided her own minor biological child to a foreigner. no, for purposes of prostitution. Again, the explanation, para may kitain ng pamilya for daily sustenance. That is not acceptable. No? Not to mention that is reprehensible. No? So, qualified trafficking in persons. Life imprisonment po yan. So that would be it for me. Thank you, fellow Rotarians and guests, for your patience in listening. I hope that the lecture helped you in appreciating our responsibility to abate, if not totally to eliminate, trafficking in persons in the Philippines. So we in Rotary, I believe we have this responsibility as well to cooperate with the government in its efforts to finally eliminate trafficking in persons in the Philippines. So mabuhay po kayo and God bless.
Wow.
Wow.
Thank you very much, Attorney Ismael Sarangaya. Sobrang ang dami namin pong natutunan ngayong gabi na to dahil sa batas na pinaliwanag niyo sa amin na sobrang naliwanagan kami about dito. Ayan. So, may I call on our dear LCP Madelay, okay, for
Yes, hello.
presenting this certificate.
Okay, so before I give this certificate of appreciation to Attorney Ismael Sarangaya Jr., I'd like to thank you very much because just a joke, ang alam ko lang yung traffic, no? Pero ang dami palang trafficking sabi. And then, marami kami natutunan and I'm sure hindi lang ako, aking mga ka-LCP at yung mga nandito sa loob ng room na to. Wow! Talagang marami palang dapat isaalang-alang, no? Because we have family, we have children, we have friends, and relatives. So, iba na rin yung may nalalaman. And again, thank you very much, Attorney Ismael Sarangaya, for your precious time. At ito ay binalak natin ito na ito ay talagang gusto mong mailahad sa lahat. Maraming salamat. We've learned a lot. For the certificate of appreciation to you, Attorney Ismael Sarangaya Jr., thank you for sharing his expertise on peace and conflict prevention and resolution shared with the participants of this webinar entitled Upholding Women's Rights, a webinar on expanded Anti-Trafficking in Person Act of 2012, given this 20th day of October 2021, held via Zoom conference. Signed by AKS Bing Carion, Chartered President, Life-Changing Governor Robert Coa, and Life-Changing President, yours truly, Madelay. Thank you very much and congratulations. We're so proud of you.